Okay, my AP language friends. So in this video, I have a massive brainchild that I'm going to put on display. So the first thing that we're going to do in terms of breaking down the various moving parts is this. So on one hand, I'm going to show you how to construct the FRQ1 from the 2022 exam, the one dealing with STEM education. I'm going to show you how my students constructed that essay while manipulating a couple of my templates. So the declarative and the inverted thesis to construct the introductory paragraph. And for the bodies, they use a template that I call the syllogistic method. So that's going to be showcased in this video. But a biggie is one of my alternative grading methods. So many of you are familiar with my work and know that I do not grade traditionally. I think it's just not a good practice, and it hasn't served me or my students well in my 20 plus years in the classroom. And here's the reason why. So in the traditional grading paradigm, 99.9% of the onus is placed on my shoulders. So student writes the essay, I begrudgingly sit on them for a couple of weeks, and then I'm like, all right, I guess I gotta grade them. Mother time is, taunting me to get these done. And I devote evenings and weekends and sacrifice a whole bunch of time scribbling as many comments as possible in their margins. I return them, and it affects no change. They don't grow and mature as writers, no matter how many comments I manage to squeeze in their margins, or my summative statements at the end. So students have to do very little heavy lifting in that. At best, they look at the grade and they're like, I love Mr. Kuhn. He's the best. He gave me an A++. Or I hate Mr. Kuhn. He's unfair. He plays favorites. He gave me a C-, right? So we get into that headspace, which I don't want to do. So in this alternative grading method, that onus is a 50-50 split. So half of it falls on me and half of it falls on the student. And it's a really good balance. So during my teaching practicums, Ted Sizer was one of my mentor teachers, and we talked at length about grading, 20 plus years ago. And I saw that immediately in my practicums. I was like, oh my goodness. I was like, this seems so futile. My students are not growing and maturing as writers, no matter how much writing I do with regards to their writing. So in this video, I'll showcase an alternative grading method that creatively uses the very hungry caterpillar. And we'll use the very hungry caterpillar to grade these essays and also to illustrate how to manipulate my templates, or heuristics if you prefer that word. So just real quick, let's review what the task is. So we're going to take a look at FRQ1 from 2022, the AP Language and Composition exam, dealing with the STEM debate. As always, when I work with teachers, I tell them that you need to Bob Ross your instruction, and here's what I mean by that. So there's a huge fundamental difference between the assigning of writing and the explicit direct teaching of it. So imagine if Bob Ross comes onto the screen and says, hello, happy little people. Today we are going to paint a beautiful New England autumnal landscape with beautiful fall foliage. And in the center of our canvas, we're going to include a New England wood-covered bridge going over a babbling brook. Bob is an awesome teacher in the sense that he gets at the canvas, he gets at the easel, and he walks us through step by step how to construct that particular painting, that scene. And the cool thing about Bob Ross, and not many people know this about him, is that he used a template. He called it a heuristic, called the wet on wet technique. Every painting he ever did, he executed the same template. And that's the cool thing about my templates. They can be used uniformly across the expository mode. So, what I'm showing you here for synthesis, they can do for rhetorical analysis, And they could use it for literary analysis, argument, persuasion, synthesis, research, universal. So all 6 FRQs for the Lang and Lit exam can be constructed solely with my templates, which is pretty cool. So, instead of talking about the theory and technique of writing and what they should do, it's very important for teachers to position themselves as the expert writer in the classroom and paint with your students. Get right up there and paint with them and show them explicitly how to do this. So here's the prompt. Since the early 2000s, the United States government and a number of corporations have sponsored initiatives to improve education in the STEM disciplines: science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. The emphasis on STEM subjects in elementary, secondary, and higher education reflects concerns that United States students are less proficient in these areas than are students in other countries. Additionally, there is a belief that mastery in STEM fields is now essential in order to join a highly technical and specialized workforce. However, not everyone is convinced that a STEM-focused curriculum is necessary and/or effective. Carefully read the following 6 sources, including the introductory information for each source. Write an essay that synthesizes material from at least 3 of the sources and develops your position on the value, if any, of initiatives to improve STEM education and increase the number of students interested in the STEM disciplines. So this is very typical of the College Board. Very fair prompt. My students came back, in May of 2022 and said, this is, easy to crush. So there's no trickeration here. You just got to take a position, yay, nay, or qualify it in many regards. So very straight up. So the question immediately is this: how do I write the introductory paragraph? And as always, you can declare or invert. Let me unpack what I mean by that, and then I'll give you 4 concrete examples of introductions that either declare or invert. So when you declare, you begin with the thesis. Just boom, out of the gate, drop the thesis. Have some kind of argument with regards to the prompt, with regard to STEM initiatives. So you're either for, against, or you're going to qualify it. So thesis out of the gate, boom, drop it. From there, it's context and background. I always like to see tier 2 level vocabulary in students writing. It is an academic task. So by tier 2, I simply mean your average run-of-the-mill SAT level word. And ideally, and you're going to see this with my student samples in a second here, I like it when my students can really teeter-totter balance the tier 2 academic diction with the colloquial and the vernacular, right? I don't want them to sound overly pedantic or contrived or pretentious, but keep it hip. Sentence constructs. This is a biggie. So many of you are familiar with my work and you know that I espouse what Strunk and White espouse, the idea or the theory that there's 12 different ways to construct a single sentence. So you should see my students wield a couple different sentence structures in order to achieve voice, rhythm, and flow. And the kicker, it's going to be 4 sentences long, no more, no less. So the introductory paragraphs that my students write with my template are exactly 4 sentences long. So begin with the thesis, context, background, tier 2 level vocabulary, manipulate the syntax for voice, rhythm, flow, exactly 4 sentences. You can flip that up on its head and end with the thesis. And when students do this, they usually begin with the context and background. Sometimes they'll get clever and maybe do a hook or an analogy. And then it's the same old tier 2 level vocabulary, like teeter-totter balance that. Manipulate the sentence constructs for voice, rhythm, and flow, and it's going to be exactly 4 sentences long. So here's the deal. And as we get into the Eric Carle piece here, The graphics that I have in these slides, you have access to them if you want. Just email me. My email will be at the end of this presentation. And I print them in color. All right, so I have access to a color printer at school. And then the students just cut them out off the paper. Sometimes if I'm lucky and fortunate, I can get cardstock, and they use these graphics as part of the writing workshop, which I'll get to in just a second. Just sit tight. So, all right, I have all of these various fruit that we print. So it goes in accordance to the story. So as we are doing our writing workshop, we look to see that students have manipulated the template or the heuristic appropriately. So the first thing that we want to make sure of as we look at the four sample introductions that we're going to explore in just a second is this. The thesis point is most essential. So based on the declarative and the inverted thesis, we have to make sure that the thesis is placed in either the first or the last sentence. All right, and we know that it's going to be exactly 4 sentences long. So we're going to put an apple next to the thesis. Ideally, we want to see tier 2 level vocabulary, right? I really like it when my students during this writing workshop also point out good use of colloquial and vernacular. So we're going to assign pairs to tier 2, like any good diction, any good vocab. So we'll place pairs next to that. Sentence variation, sentence constructs. I think those are blueberries. I could be wrong. They look like eggplants. I don't know what they are. But ultimately, what I want my students to do is to be able to manipulate their sentences and their syntax to avoid that short, choppy sentence, short, choppy sentence, short, choppy sentence, which struggling and emerging writers typically do. So we'll also look to make sure that the introductions contain enough context and background. And then lastly, grammar, punctuation, syntax. We'll make sure that everything is up to snuff along those lines. So in terms of how we do this, each kid in the class has a printout of these things here, of the apple, the pear, the blueberry, the strawberry, the oranges. And students will submit their essay to me, and we will project them on the overhead. So I will present them to class anonymously, but if a student wants to identify themselves, they're more than capable of doing that, and we allow that. And oftentimes students do want to identify that it is their work so that they get direct feedback. And we just break it down bit by bit, introduction by introduction. This is awesome because I strongly contend that the more writing a student sees, the better they are going to become as writers. And that's something that traditional grading methods I hate about it, is that the teacher's the only one that sees the writing. So students aren't looking at each other's work. We play Lord, we play God of composition, we hold all the dominion. It's like, no, give it back, man, give it back to the kids. So let's take a look at a couple of examples. But first, I forgot to say this. Let me back up. So the other thing too is we look to see if there's anything extraneous in the introduction. As you know, reading The Very Hungry Caterpillar, he gets very, very fat, right, and turns into a butterfly. So he gets into the cake, the ice cream, the pickles, the cheese, the salami, the lollipop, the pie, the sausage, the muffins and the watermelons, and becomes a very fat. So even though we're using templates, and I Bob Ross the heck out of this for students, sometimes students still do some extraneous stuff in there. So these icons here, we will place, let's say, for example, if a student begins to quote the sources in the introduction, that's something extraneous. In my template, we don't quote. Let's say that the kid rephrases or regurgitates the prompt. We don't do that in my template, so that would be extraneous. Let's say they have a bunch of extra commas or something of that nature. That's extraneous. Let's say they have more than 4 sentences. That's extraneous. So all in all, and I'll go back here. So students have the fruit, they have the goodies, they're cut out. And basically what we're going to do is, as students are presenting their introductions, we're going to go up and place our fruit, our vegetable, our junk next to particular things within the rubric. So I'll give you an example. So let's take a look at this introduction here. Since its inception, STEM initiatives have crossed the desk of 5 U.S. presidents. So we know this is going to invert, right? They're taking kind of a broad view of the prompt here in many ways. So we don't have a thesis yet, so that should come last sentence. So they're starting with context and background. In other words, these measures have had nearly 2 decades and countless taxpayer dollars to take root and advance profound change. But the reality is this: nothing has really changed. Given that American students are still leagues behind their international counterparts in the STEM disciplines, a continuance in funding such programs lacks common sense. So the thesis is definitely coming last sentence here. So let's say that this paper belongs to Jason, and we have 18 kids in the class. I don't want to monopolize the conversation and break this down. I've trained my students to talk about writing. So Jason identifies, he reads this to the class, and we have a conversation about it. So let's say that student Sarah says, all right, I want to place my apple on Jason's draft, on Jason's introduction. I think he has a very good thesis in the last sentence. This is a perfect inverted thesis. So, given that American students are still leagues behind their international counterparts in the STEM disciplines, a continuance in funding such programs lacks common sense. So, Sarah puts an apple there. All right, that's definitely a thesis. Let's say that we have Chad in class, and he says, I really want to make a comment about Jason's vocabulary. I'm going to place some pears up on Jason's piece. So I want to put a pear next to inception. Great word. I want to put a pear on initiatives. But I also want to put a pear on cross the desk. I like the use of the vernacular and the colloquial there. I think profound is a good word. I like the use of still leagues behind, some colloquial and vernacular there. And I like the word continuance. So I'm putting pairs all over those words. I think it's really good. And then in the thesis, I like this colloquialism: lacks common sense. So this good teeter-totter balance between the colloquial, the vernacular, and the tier 2 academic. I'm given a bunch of pairs. Perfect. All right, so the kids just have a conversation about this. And then let's say Emily wants to talk about sentence variation and grammar, punctuation, syntax. So she says, I love that third sentence, and as it segues into the fourth sentence. But the reality is this: hyphen, nothing has really changed. The emphasis there, it's emphatic. But look at the articulation of the thesis. Given that American students are still leagues behind their international counterparts in the STEM disciplines, comma, a continuance in funding such programs lacks common sense. So all the sentences are varied. There's nothing running intrusively parallel in terms of like the overuse of the short, simple declarative sentence, or conversely, a long succession of loose sentences stacked upon each other. So there's good voice rhythm and flow. All right. So ultimately, students have to do this as well. Does this particular example yield the butterfly effect? Does this ascend the rubric? Does this look like an introduction that a kid that's going to get a 5 or a 6? Does this ascend the rubric? Does it transcend the rubric? I think a lot of people would give this a butterfly. right? So I like to celebrate writing and to have students acknowledge good writing and see good writing. So go back here to this. Is there anything extraneous in here? So sometimes students overuse their big words, and they think that the more million-dollar words that they incorporate into a paper, the better their writing is. And that's a huge misunderstanding. So I like the vocabulary in this one in particular. I think it stays in the wheelhouse. I think there's a good blend, a good teeter-totter balance. So I don't think there's anything extraneous going on there. Note that the kid did not quote any quotes. He did not regurgitate the prompt. So I don't think there's anything extraneous going on in here. It's a straight 4-sentence nuts and bolts, context, background, thesis statement, inverted, straight up inverted. So let's move to the next. Let's say that this belongs to Sarah. The American educational system needs to make a decision as to whether or not it is producing a national workforce that are soulless automatons or a nation of well-rounded independent thinkers. STEM in and of itself is inadequate. To be a fully functioning member of society, one needs direct and specific training in other things such as the arts, soft skills, and basic common sense things that curriculums often overlook. For STEM to make a significant social impact, other disciplines will need to be included. So again, this is a straight up inverted thesis. So, I want the class to do this, not me, right? So this is where they can grade, they can offer their own feedback, they can be the teachers. So somebody's going to say, I want to put the apple in that 4th sentence, because that's where the thesis is, and it's exactly 4 sentences. And we'll again talk about the vocabulary in this. So people will students will pick out words like automaton. Is that a good word? I think it works great. Um, it's got a good blend of the colloquial, the vernacular, and the academic. The sentence structures are phenomenal, so the students can figure this out. Does it have anything extraneous? Well, let's talk about this. One thing I would talk about with my students, and I'm not necessarily certain that they would pick up on this. I would give this a whole bunch of food for saying something original. None of the sources talk about this particular thesis, take this stance. And I really harp on my students about the following. In the directions, it says, your argument must be central. So it's key, crucial that students not regurgitate, chew up the sources and spit them back and, cling to somebody's thesis from the sources. So this one was very good. And again, it's just a straight up inverted. So I'll show you a couple of others. The acronym of STEM is missing some crucial letters from the alphabet. First, in order to create a world-class workforce, one needs to include the letters LAE, liberal arts education. Second, given that the whole student must be educated, the letters SEL must also be added, social emotional learning. Initiatives to improve STEM are needed, but they need to be done sensibly with the best intentions of the nation and individual in mind. So again, students, have these, foods. They can go up and basically break it down. And that's the glory of using a template. It's very mathematic. It's very computative. It's, there's certain things that we expect to see in the writing, and it's all here. So this definitely has a thesis. The sentence constructs are very varied and nuanced. There's plenty of tier 2 without overdoing it. There's sufficient context and background, and the grammar, the punctuation, and the syntax are all there. So these kids, these are good samples. So let's say that I were to throw up the work of a struggling emerging writer, and it had grammar, punctuation, syntactical errors. that we would likewise use the oranges, and I would want students to come up and let's just say, for example, that this should be a semicolon instead of a comma, which I'm just making it up, just giving you an example here. I would want my students to come up and put an orange there and say, oopsies, you got a comma splice there. Put a semicolon there in place of the comma. Students take ownership of the process. So ultimately, in this exercise, what I have my students do is write in their margin what they think with regards to their introduction. After the class has evaluated it, and we've put up our hungry caterpillar icons, write in the margin to me, before submitting the paper to me, what they see going on in their introduction, and then I can have a conversation back with them with regards to what's going on in their introduction and help steer them in the right direction, or just give them a hearty pat on the back and say, job well done, it's excellent, keep going, right? So 50-50 split of the onus between student teacher in the grading process, right? So here's one more. To be a world leader, there needs to be greater focus on STEM education. So we had not seen a declarative yet. So this one's declaring. Clearly, the American educational system is lagging in many areas, but neglecting to shore up its most vital workforce would be a costly error both politically and economically. What the world needs right now is specialization, not loosey-goosey training in disciplines that hold no pragmatic value. The world is in peril right now, and STEM initiatives are clearly a perfect panacea. So it doesn't matter. Thesis comes first, thesis comes last, context background, focus on that vocab, focus on those sentence constructs, nothing extraneous comes in. Straight up declare or invert every single time. So that's how we roll with the declarative and the inverted thesis for the purposes of writing synthesis. So the next question is this: how do I write the body paragraphs? You're going to proceed syllogistically. So I'm going to say everything that I always say in my videos. Proceed syllogistically when you write your body paragraphs. And I won't go into the syllogistic method to any great detail or length here. I have other videos where I do that. But in brief, a syllogism is just basically when you argue from premise to conclusion. It's very mathematical. It's how you sustain and create a line of reasoning and stay cogent in an argument. So the first premise might say something like this: arsenic is deadly. Second premise: my dog ate arsenic. Conclusion: my dog is going to die. When we write for the purposes of synthesis, the first premise is going to be an argument containing a why reason. And the reason being is that, again, it goes to the directions. Your argument must be central. So in the thesis, we didn't get into the whys, right? We're not saying why we are espousing a particular belief with regards to STEM. We just are addressing the prompt. Yes, no, maybe, it depends. So the why is saved for the first premise, and it should be phrased in the form of an argument. This is always going to be 3 sentences long unless the student has a reason to make it shorter or longer. And I'll model it for you in just a second. So the second premise is going to be the textual support, and it's the teeter-totter balance of quoting and paraphrasing. And the conclusion is the textual analysis. I always tell my students, if they are sustaining a line of reasoning, a clear line of reasoning, that the first premise is a promise. You got to shake hands with that brother when you get to the end of your syllogistic body paragraph and make sure you bring it all the way back. So good students ask good questions, and they say things like this: Mr. Kuhn, we're dealing with templates. Your introduction paragraph template is exactly 4 sentences. What do you have in mind for a syllogistic body paragraph? How many sentences should we be shooting for? And my answer to that is 10 to 12. To have enough support and analysis and to fully flesh out a line of reasoning, I think 10 to 12 sentences is perfect. So in terms of continuing our writing workshop and our alternative grading methods with the body paragraphs, we would do this. Is the syllogistic body paragraph 10 to 12 sentences? Even though I Bob Ross the heck out of this, I still get students that want to submit those little itty bitty 4 or 5 sentence body paragraphs that go nowhere. They say nothing, right? So an apple for that. First premise is 3 sentences long and contains a why reason. Will be with the pairs. Appropriate number of sources are incorporated. I still want to look at voice, tier 2, grammar, punctuation, syntax. So you can fix the variables in here any way you want. So one thing that we practice a lot of is embedding quotes, and I call it the 5-word rule. So I could change, the whatever those are, the eggplants or the blueberries, to the 5-word rule. And the 5-word rule is this, that if a student places a minimum of 5 words in front of a quote and keeps the quote small, then the quote should sound conversational. And you may need to use brackets, of course. So you can change whatever your focus is going to be for the body paragraphs and whatever aspect of the template you want. So here's the deal. The good eats. 5-word rule for embedding quotes. Line of reasoning stays intact. Promise of the first premise is kept, and the conclusion of the syllogism links back. So we'll use the goody treats, the goody eats to indicate those things, right? So, and then again, students have butterflies. If we see really good writing, we're going to slap a butterfly on it. So let's talk about that first premise real quick, because it gets confusing sometimes, what I mean by a why reason. So for struggling and emerging writers, I tell them literally say reason why in your first premise, just to make sure that you have an argument that's staying central. So this is an example that I wrote just to demonstrate. And again, note that it's 3 sentences. So this is going to be the umbrella concept for the entire syllogistic body paragraph. One reason why STEM initiatives have faltered is because they have not dangled the proverbial carrot in front of students' noses. In order for these measures to really recognize their full potential, there must be incentives like free college tuition and job placement guarantees. Otherwise, people will not buy in, as is evidenced over the last 20 years. So let's go back here. All right. So clearly we have a why reason there. And during the writing workshop, I like to have my students break down the first premise in the language of a promise. So I have them say, I promise you, dear reader, that I'm going to talk about this or these things, right? In terms of a why. So it's exactly 3 sentences long. The vocab is nice. The sentence structures are good. The grammar, the punctuation, syntax is perfect, right? Good voice. We're cruising so far. So let's take a look at a whole syllogism. If STEM-focused curriculum does not inherit a few more vowels and consonants, there's no reason why institutions should continue to pursue it as an initiative. Standing alone, the acronym clearly does not meet the diverse needs of the total student. 20 years of evidence supports this fact. So that's 3 sentences. Put it in a promise. What are we promising here? I'm looking for some kind of conversation about how STEM needs more letters. Like as a standalone, there's just not enough there. And this student is advocating for more vowels and consonants. So that's the promise that is being made here, right? So in the 4th sentence, the student should immediately get into the source material, right? So let's see what they do here. Gary May concurs in that he would like to see an A added to STEM, with the A standing for arts, source F. Great quote. All right. And it's aligned. Have we kept the promise of the first premise? Is that quote germane to what we promised? It sure is. All right. And now we do this blend of quote paraphrase analysis, quote paraphrase analysis, and we know we need to work in other sources. Ironically, policymakers on the opposing side of the argument quickly forget the fact that their liberal arts education played a huge role in their success. While the likes of Marco Rubio are bluntly calling for more welders and fewer philosophers, he, as well as others, neglect to see that the undergraduate able to cobble together a course schedule integrating STEM and the humanities may be able to reap rich rewards. Source C. So now we're weaving things together here. We got F and C talking to each other. So did that quote and paraphrase align with the promise of the first premise? You betcha. We're still talking about vowels and consonants. We're still talking about adding letters to STEM. The rewards derived from the A and account for statements like the following from our nation's elite. MIT biology prepared me for medicine. Literature prepared me to be a doctor. Source E. So we're weaving everything together here. The sources are talking to each other. Education in absence of the A breeds a workforce and a collective individual highly incapable of original thought and creativity. Clearly, medical knowledge is requisite, but so is the ability to interpret a patient's account and story, a skill hard to foster and grow without adequate exposure to the A. Right? And this, we didn't include the source there. That needs to be there, of course. But all of these are weaving together, right? They're all talking back to that first premise. We're staying cogent. Arsenic is deadly. My dog ate arsenic. My dog is going to die. One thing the diehard STEM pundits overlook is the human touch, an implicit work skill that needs to be taught. 76% of prospective employees value ethical judgment and integrity, and 63% place a strong value on soft skills. Source C. All right, we got plenty of sources going on here, plenty of support and analysis. Now let's wrap it up. This is the conclusion of the syllogistic body paragraph. So we got to go shake hands with the first premise, shake hands with the prompt, shake hands with the thesis. Here's the thing. These skills are not congenital. They're developed and honed, and when honed, curriculums include a healthy dose of the arts and humanities. As such, STEM initiatives must contain a critical vowel. So we forgot a few words there in the end, but that's what happens with timed writing. So let's go back to this, right? So students can look at that particular sample and, did they include the appropriate number of sources and did they incorporate them well? So we have a conversation about that. Great voice, right? So good tier 2, the colloquial, the vernacular, the grammar, punctuation, syntax seems to be all in play. It was a fantastic why reason. And then let's get to the goodies. Was the line of reasoning intact? Definitely. And I want to have like a conversation. I want students to facilitate that conversation to show how all of those quotes and paraphrases were germane to the promise of the first premise. The conclusion linked back. The 5-word rule was in play. Everything in that was pretty stellar and a job well done. Give it a butterfly. A couple of things needed to be tweaked on it, but overall, very good job. So that's how we do this. Now, here's the thing. So when you're looking at a lot of student work and doing things like this Eric Carle, the Very Hungry Caterpillar exercise, one thing I like to do is to have my students grade themselves. So let's say you have the blessing of having a relatively small class, like 14 students, as sometimes our AP classes are. And, students looked at, I don't know, you don't even need to look at all 14. Maybe you did this with like 5 papers. Have students write in their margins some comments about everything that is an integral part of the template. Their vocab, their sentence structure, their line of reasoning, the quality of their introduction in comparison to what they saw. Did they earn a butterfly? And the kicker, you can do this. Have them grade themselves. And I often do this. I say, if we are within 5 points of each other, I'll give you the higher score. So at my school, we have to convert our AP scores into 0 to 100. So let's say that, Jason says, I think I deserve an 88 because, and I read it and I was like, well, I was thinking 91. So I'll give him the 91 because we're within 5 points of each other. Take the burden off of ourselves, put the onus back on the kids, have them be a participant in the grading in the process, and a valued member of their own learning process. I think that's really crucial. That's really key. So, all right, let me wrap this up. So, over the course of the summer months, I am offering some summer short course series, and I do have an alternative grading methods program where we're going to take a look at all 40 of my alternative grading methods, and you'll have access to those 40 grading methods. So it's going to be a 2-hour live intensive in Zoom. I'm going to offer that a couple of times this summer. So take a look at www.teachinghowtowrite.com. It's a very cool course, and like grading this way really restores your evenings and weekends and frees you up. Traditional grading methods, I think, are for the birds. It's like shoveling a pile of smoke for the weekend. It's just not the most effective way to do things. So I've really gotten away from it. I'm also going to be doing AP Strategies for Success, where we're going to take a look at all of the FRQs, Lang and Lit, and I'm going to demonstrate how to write each FRQ while manipulating and incorporating or pulling the strings of my templates. I've already done the Word Slam Academy, the Nuance Academy, and by popular demand, I think I'm going to offer them again. So stay tuned. And then the Teach It Right 5-week mastermind is now going to be run through the National Writing Project, which is fantastic news for teachers that need to get their PD stamps, their hours stamped. The National Writing Project can do that. So I'm going to be a lead teacher for them, and we are starting August 9th with the 5-week mastermind. There's plenty of information on my website, or you can email me at teachingwritingcoach@gmail.com. If you're interested in these slides, again, email me, teachingwritingcoach@gmail.com. And for more information, teachinghowtowrite.com. For now, be well, take care, happy writing, happy teaching.